Chapter 6. Early Signs of Decline. While progress continues on many fronts, disturbing signs of decline are beginning to emerge. In the early years of this new millennium, United Nations demographers stunned the world when they announced that the average life expectancy in 38 AIDS-afflicted countries in sub-Saharan Africa had fallen to only 45 years, 10 years below what it would have been in the absence of AIDS. For the first time in the modern era, life expectancy, a seminal indicator of development, has dropped for a large segment of humanity. This failure of leadership to curb the spread of the virus in dozens of countries is quite literally reversing the march of progress. Is this breakdown of the political system an anomaly? Or is it an early sign that the complexity of emerging problems is overwhelming weaker national governments? Troubles are not limited to Africa. In Russia, life expectancy for males has fallen to 59 years, down from some 64 years in 1990. In China, with dangerously high pollution levels, more people are dying from cancer than any other disease. The United States, with a highly productive economy, but a troubled society, now has 960,000 farmers and 2 million prison inmates, more than twice as many people in jail as live on the land. The gap between rich and poor grows ever wider, putting more stress on the international system. Differences in life expectancy are wider than ever, with people in Botswana and Swaziland living on average less than 40 years, and those in Japan and Sweden living 80 years or more. One reason for the wide gap in life expectancy is the HIV epidemic. Another is hunger. After declining in recent decades, the number of hungry people in the world turned upward in the late 1990s and continues to rise. The stresses in our early 21st century civilization take many forms. Economically, we see them in the widening income gap between the world's rich and poor. Socially, they take the form of the widening gap in education and healthcare. Environmentally, we have a swelling flow of refugees as productive land turns to desert, and as wells go dry. Politically, we see the stresses within societies in conflict over basic resources such as cropland, grazing land, and water, and, perhaps most fundamentally, in the growing number of failing states. Our socially divided world. The social and economic gap between the world's richest 1 billion people and its poorest 1 billion has no historical precedent. Not only is this gap wide, it is widening. The poorest billion are trapped at subsistence level, and the richest billion are becoming wealthier with each passing year. The economic gap can be seen in the contrasts in nutrition, education, disease patterns, family size, and life expectancy. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization reports that 862 million people are undernourished and often hungry. A much larger number, roughly 1.6 billion people, are overnourished and overweight, most of them suffering from excessive caloric intake, exercise deprivation, or a combination of the two. While close to 1 billion people worry whether they will be able to eat, another 1.6 billion worry about eating too much. Hunger is the most visible face of poverty. Those that are chronically hungry are not getting enough food to achieve full physical and mental development, and to maintain adequate levels of physical activity. The majority of the underfed and underweight people are concentrated in the Indian subcontinent and sub-Saharan Africa regions that contain 1.4 billion and 800 million people, respectively. 25 years ago, the nutritional status of Asia's population giants, India and China, was similar. But since then China has eliminated most of its hunger, whereas India has made limited progress. During this last quarter century, China has accelerated the shift to smaller families. While gains in food production in India were absorbed largely by population growth, those in China went mostly to raising consumption per person. Malnutrition takes its heaviest toll among the young, who are most vulnerable during their rapid physical and mental development. In both India and Bangladesh, almost half of all children under 5 are underweight and malnourished. In Ethiopia, 47% of children are undernourished, while in Nigeria the figure is 29%, and these are two of Africa's most populous countries. Although it is not surprising that those who are underfed and underweight are concentrated in developing countries, it is perhaps surprising that most of them live in rural communities. More often than not, the undernourished are either landless, or they live on plots of land so small that they are effectively landless. The penalties of being undernourished begin at birth. A UN report estimates that 20 million underweight infants are born each year to mothers who also are malnourished. The study indicates that these children suffer lasting effects in the form of impaired immune systems, neurological damage, and retarded physical growth. David Barker of Britain's University of Southampton observed soberly that 60% of all newborns in India would be in intensive care had they been born in California. Disease patterns also reflect the widening gap between the rich and the poor. The billion poorest suffer mostly from infectious diseases: malaria, tuberculosis, dysentery, measles, respiratory infections, and AIDS. Malnutrition leaves infants and small children even more vulnerable to such infectious diseases. Unsafe drinking water takes a heavier toll on those with hunger-weakened immune systems, resulting in millions of fatalities each year. In contrast, among the billion at the top of the global economic scale, it is diseases related to aging and lifestyle excesses, including cardiovascular disease, obesity, smoking, high-fat diets, and exercise deprivation, that cause most deaths. There is also a demographic divide. Close to 1 billion people live in countries where population size is essentially stable, but another billion also live in countries where population is projected to double or more by 2050. Education levels, too, reflect the deep divide. In some industrial countries, for example, Canada and Japan, more than half of all young people now graduate from college with either 2 or 4-year degrees. By contrast, in developing countries, 72 million youngsters of elementary school age are not enrolled in school at all. Although 5 centuries have passed since Gutenberg invented the printing press, some 781 million adults are illiterate. Unable to read, they are also excluded from the use of computers and the internet. Without adult literacy programs, their prospects of escaping poverty are not good. The world's illiterates are concentrated in a handful of the more populous countries, most of them in Asia and Africa. Prominent among these are Bangladesh, China, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Pakistan, plus Brazil and Mexico in Latin America. From 1990 to 2000, China and Indonesia made large gains in reducing illiteracy. Other countries also making meaningful progress were Brazil, Mexico, and Nigeria. However, in 4 other populous countries, Bangladesh, Egypt, India, and Pakistan, the number of illiterates increased. Illiteracy and poverty tend to reinforce each other, because illiterate women typically have much larger families than literate women do, and because each year of schooling raises earning power by 10–20%. In Brazil, for instance, illiterate women have more than 6 children each on average. Literate women have only 2. To be poor often means to be sick. As with illiteracy, ill health and poverty are closely linked. Health is closely related to access to safe water, something that 1.1 billion people lack. Waterborne diseases claim more than 3 million lives each year, mostly as a result of dysentery and cholera, and mostly among children. Infant mortality in affluent societies averages 8 per 1,000 live births. In the 50 poorest countries it averages 95 per 1,000, nearly 12 times as high. The connection between poverty and disease is strong, but it has been broken for most of humanity by economic development. The challenge now is to break this link for that remaining minority who do not have access to safe water, vaccines, education, and basic health care. Health challenge growing. health challenges are becoming more numerous as new infectious diseases such as SARS, West Nile virus, and avian flu emerge. In addition, the accumulation of chemical pollutants in the environment is starting to take a toll. While infectious diseases are fairly well understood, the health effects of many environmental pollutants are not yet known. Among the leading infectious diseases, malaria claims more than 1 million lives each year, 89% of them in Africa. The number of people who suffer from it most of their lives is many times greater. Economist Jeffrey Sachs, head of Columbia University's Earth Institute, estimates that reduced worker productivity and other costs associated with malaria are cutting economic growth by a full percentage point in countries with heavily infected populations. Although diseases such as malaria and cholera exact a heavy toll, there is no recent precedent of a disease affecting as many people as the HIV epidemic does. To find anything similar to such a potentially devastating loss of life, we have to go back to the smallpox decimation of Native American communities in the 16th century, or to the bubonic plague that took roughly a fourth of Europe's population during the 14th century. HIV is an epidemic of epic proportions that, if not checked soon, could take more lives during this century than were claimed by all the wars of the last century. Since the human immunodeficiency virus was identified in 1981, it has spread worldwide. By the end of 2006, the number of people infected had climbed to 86 million. Of this total, more than 40 million have died so far. Today, 25 million HIV-positive people today live in sub-Saharan Africa, but only 1 million or so are being treated with antiretroviral drugs. Infection rates are climbing. In the absence of effective treatment, the areas of sub-Saharan Africa with the highest infection rates face a staggering loss of life. Countries like Botswana and Zimbabwe could lose more than a fifth of their adult populations within a decade. The HIV epidemic affects every facet of life and every sector of the economy. Food production per person, already lagging in most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, is now falling fast in some as the number of field workers shrinks. The downward spiral in family welfare typically begins when the first adult falls victim to the illness or development that is doubly disruptive, because for each person who is sick and unable to work, another adult must care for that person. Education is also affected as the ranks of teachers are decimated by the virus. With students, when one or both parents die, children are forced to stay home simply because there is not enough money to buy books and to pay school fees. The effects on healthcare are equally devastating. In many hospitals in Eastern and Southern Africa, a majority of the beds are now occupied by AIDS victims, leaving less space for those with other illnesses. Already overworked doctors and nurses are often stretched to the breaking point. With healthcare systems now unable to provide even basic care, the toll of traditional disease is also rising. Life expectancy is dropping, not only because of AIDS, but also because of the deterioration in overall healthcare associated with it. The epidemic is leaving millions of orphans in its wake. Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to have 18 million AIDS orphans by 2010, children who have lost at least one parent to the disease. There is no precedent for millions of street children in Africa. The extended family, once capable of absorbing orphan children, is now itself being weakened by the loss of adults, leaving children to bury their parents and fend for themselves. For some girls, the only option is what has come to be known as survival sex. Michael Grunwald writes from Swaziland in the Washington Post. In the countryside, teenage Swazi girls are selling sex and spreading HIV for $5 an encounter, exactly what it costs to hire oxen for a day of ploughing. The HIV epidemic in Africa is now a development problem, threatening not only to undermine future progress, but also to eliminate past gains. It threatens food security, undermines the educational system, and dries up foreign investment. It is overwhelming governments, leading to more failing states. Stephen Lewis, when he was the UN Special Envoy for HIV/AIDS in Africa, said that the epidemic can be curbed and the infection trends can be reversed, but it will take help from the international community. The failure to fully fund the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria, he said, is mass murder by complacency.